The alarm on my ship tore through the silence like a blade through glass, and my first thought was not fear. It was disbelief. 7 ships had dropped out of warp above the human colony called Haven Ridge, and none of them belonged to the Concord. I am Vex, designation 7, and until that moment, I had believed my assignment was the most boring posting in the entire observation division. Watch the humans. Log their behavior. Do not interfere. Do not reveal myself. Return in 30 cycles with a report that no one would ever read carefully, because humans were rated as a negligible species in every archive my people had ever compiled. Emotional, short-lived, fragile, a footnote species, destined to either destroy themselves or be quietly absorbed into someone else's empire within a few centuries. That was the briefing. That was the expectation. That was the lie I did not yet know I had been told. My cloaked vessel hung in high orbit, invisible to every scanner Haven Ridge possessed, and invisible, I assumed, to the 7 raider ships that had just appeared above the colony, like a knife appearing above a sleeping throat. I recognized the hull patterns instantly. Skarn raiders. Slavers, mostly, though some hunted for parts, for minerals, for anything that could be sold in the lawless markets beyond Concord space. They were not supposed to be here. Haven Ridge was too small, too remote, too insignificant to draw their attention. And yet here they were, weapons already charging, aimed at a mining outpost that had no orbital defense fleet, no military escort, nothing but a scattering of prefabricated domes, and a few thousand people who had come here to dig metal out of frozen rock and build something quiet for their families. I switched my sensors to full spectrum and began recording, because that was my duty, and because some part of me, some small analytical part that had not yet caught up with what my instincts were screaming, still believed I was about to watch something routine. Raiders threaten a weak colony, the colony surrenders, someone loses everything. I document it. I file it away with the thousands of similar reports already sitting in the Concord archive, gathering dust, changing nothing. That is not what happened. The lead raider ship, a heavy cruiser with a scarred hull that told me its captain had survived more battles than he had any right to, opened a channel to the surface. I patched into the transmission immediately, translating in real time. "Attention Haven Ridge Colony Administration," the voice said, flat and mechanical, the kind of voice that had delivered this exact threat 100 times before. "This is Captain Korath, of the free trading vessel Ash Talon. Your colony is undefended. Your comm relay will be destroyed in 60 seconds as a demonstration. Surrender your population for processing, and no further destruction will occur. Resist, and we will take what we want by force, and there will be nothing left to surrender." I had heard variations of this speech from Skarn raiders before, on other worlds, in other systems, back when I was still training under senior observers, who taught me how to catalog fear without feeling it myself. The pattern was always the same: threaten, demonstrate, wait for the panic, collect the survivors like cargo. I opened a secondary feed into the colony's public communication network, the one channel that Haven Ridge had not yet realized I was monitoring, and I watched the response ripple outward through the settlement. A man named Ethan Brooks, listed in colony records as the site administrator, received the message first. His feed showed him standing in a small operations room, surrounded by monitors, and I expected to see his face change into the shape of terror. Instead, his expression did something I did not have a word for yet. His jaw tightened. His eyes went very still. And then, calmly, without raising his voice, he reached for a comm switch and said 4 words that meant nothing to me at the time. "Initiate Quiet House Protocol." 60 seconds later, exactly as promised, a beam of energy lanced down from the lead raider cruiser and struck the colony's comm relay tower. The structure folded in on itself and collapsed, a small column of dust and debris rising into the thin atmosphere. It was meant to be terrifying. It was meant to prove that resistance was pointless. I watched the colony's external cameras go dark, one by one, not from damage, but from the humans themselves shutting them off. I watched interior lights across Haven Ridge dim to almost nothing. I watched 3,000 human life signs, which moments before had been scattered across homes and workshops and communal halls in the ordinary, chaotic pattern of daily life, begin to move. Not toward the exits, not toward the transports parked at the edge of the settlement. Not in any pattern that resembled the fear response my species' archives described as universal among primitive cultures facing overwhelming force. They moved toward positions, coordinated, silent, deliberate. I felt something cold settle into my chest that had nothing to do with the temperature of my ship's cabin. I pulled up the historical files I had been given before this assignment, scrolling through summary after summary of human military conflicts, human colonial disputes, human responses to threat. Every file agreed on the same core assessment. Humans were reactive, disorganized under pressure, prone to either fleeing or fighting in uncoordinated bursts of desperate emotion. There was no precedent in my archive for what I was watching now, which was a civilian population responding to an existential threat with the eerie, practiced calm of a species that had rehearsed this exact scenario more times than I wanted to consider. On the Raider channel, Captain Korath's voice returned, laced with the first hint of impatience I had heard from him. "Comm relay destroyed. Awaiting surrender terms. Administrator Brooks, respond." There was no response. I zoomed my sensors down toward the operations room where Ethan Brooks had given his 4-word order, and found it empty. The monitors still glowed, feeding false data, looping footage of colonists going about ordinary business in the central plaza. A decoy designed to make anyone watching from orbit believe the settlement was still functioning normally, still unaware, still helpless. I checked the real feed beneath the false one, the one buried in the colony's maintenance network that I had only found because I had nothing else to do during my 30 cycles of boredom, except map every inch of Haven Ridge's infrastructure out of sheer professional habit. Ethan Brooks was no longer in the operations room. He was moving through a service corridor beneath the colony, flanked by 2 other colonists, a young woman I identified from residency records as Olivia Hart, and an older man named Lucas Bennett, both of them carrying equipment that my sensors could not immediately classify, because it did not match anything in my archive's catalog of human civilian tools. Above them, the Raider transports began their descent, 7 landing craft breaking away from the cruisers and dropping toward the colony's outer perimeter, engines glowing bright against the darkening sky. Captain Korath's voice crackled across every open channel on the planet, confident, almost bored, the voice of a predator who had done this so many times that the outcome was no longer in question for him. "Ground teams, you have your assignments. This one should be easy. Scans show no weapon signatures, no defense grid, no resistance capability whatsoever. Move in, secure the population centers, and let's be done with this by nightfall." I sat in my cloaked ship, sensors recording every word, every heat signature, every flicker of movement across the darkened colony below, and I felt the analytical distance I had been trained to maintain begin to crack. Because I had run the same scans Korath's ships were running, I had access to the same surface data, the same thermal readings, the same absence of any detectable weapons system anywhere in Haven Ridge. By every measurable standard, the colony was exactly what the Raiders believed it to be. Unarmed, unprepared, undefended. And yet 3,000 humans had just vanished from their homes into a silence so complete and so coordinated that it did not feel like the behavior of a frightened population at all. It felt like the behavior of something that had been waiting. The first landing craft touched down at the edge of the colony in a cloud of frozen dust, its ramp lowering before the engines had even finished cycling down. I watched a squad of Skarn Raiders move down the ramp in loose formation, weapons ready but posture relaxed, the unmistakable body language of soldiers who did not expect to need those weapons at all. Somewhere beneath the colony, in a corridor my sensors could barely penetrate, Ethan Brooks stopped walking. He turned to the 2 colonists beside him, said something too quiet for my translation matrix to fully capture, and Olivia Hart nodded once, before disappearing down a side passage with the equipment she carried. I did not know it yet, but I was no longer watching the beginning of a surrender. I was watching the beginning of something my archives had no name for, something no Concord observer had ever recorded in the entire history of First Contact Protocol, something that would end that night with 7 Raider ships and a captain named Korath, learning exactly why the humans of Haven Ridge had gone so very, very quiet. My sensors kept recording. My hands, or the appendages my species uses in place of hands, had gone still on the console in front of me. I told myself this was still routine. I told myself I was simply documenting a species' unusual but ultimately futile response to overwhelming force, the same as I had documented a dozen other doomed colonies on a dozen other worlds during my training. I told myself a great many things in those last few minutes of calm. None of them turned out to be true. The last landing craft touched down. The raider squads began fanning out toward the colony's central buildings, confident, unhurried, already treating Haven Ridge as a conquered territory rather than a target still to be secured. Captain Korath's voice rang out one final time across the open channel, addressed to his crew, but I heard every word. No resistance detected. This will be the easiest harvest we've had in cycles. Begin collection. I watched the raiders walk deeper into the darkened colony, past empty homes, past silent workshops, past a central plaza still looping its false footage of ordinary life to satisfy any scan from above. I watched them move with the casual confidence of predators who had never once, in all their years of raiding, been made to feel like prey. Somewhere below them, in the dark, 3,000 humans waited. And I realized, with a slow, creeping dread that no amount of Concord training had ever prepared me for, that I was not watching a massacre about to happen to the people of Haven Ridge. I was watching one about to happen because of them. The last light in the colony went out. The raiders kept walking, and I kept recording, because that was my duty, and because I had no idea yet just how wrong every report in my archive had been about the species I had been sent to observe. The silence stretched on. Somewhere in that darkness, something was about to move, and when it did, nothing I thought I understood about humanity would survive the next few hours intact. The first raider squad reached the central plaza 6 minutes after landing, and I watched Captain Korath's confidence grow with every step his men took unopposed. I had adjusted my sensors to track every heat signature across Haven Ridge, every flicker of movement, every whisper of sound that my translation matrix could pick up from the open channels the raiders still used, careless in their certainty that nothing on this frozen little world could threaten them. Their formation was loose. Their weapons were held low. 2 of them were laughing about something, the sound crackling through the comm feed with the easy carelessness of men who had done this 100 times before and expected this to be the 101st. I told myself I was simply observing. I told myself that whatever the humans of Haven Ridge were planning, it would not matter, because 7 armed raider squads against 3,000 unarmed civilians was not a fight. It was an inevitability. My archive had never recorded a single instance of a technologically inferior civilian population successfully repelling an organized raid, and I had no reason yet to believe Haven Ridge would be the first exception. I had a great many reasons to believe that within the hour. I simply did not know it yet. Captain Korath's voice crackled across the open channel again, directed at his ground teams. Team 1, proceed to the administration building. Team 2, secure the residential domes. Team 3, with me, we take the central plaza. Remember, our clients want them alive and in good condition. No unnecessary damage. I noted the phrase with a distant, clinical part of my mind. Alive and in good condition. Slavers, then, exactly as I had suspected. The Skarn had no interest in destroying Haven Ridge. They wanted its people, whole and functional, to be sold somewhere beyond the reach of any law that might object. It was, I would later understand, the single greatest miscalculation Captain Korath ever made, though not for the reason he might have expected. Team 1 reached the administration building and found it empty. Not hastily abandoned, not ransacked in a panic, but empty, in the deliberate, tidy way of a place that had been vacated with purpose. The raiders searched 2 floors and reported nothing, not even a struggle, not even a dropped personal item. Korath's voice, when it returned, had lost a fraction of its earlier ease. Report location of colony leadership. Silence answered him. Not the silence of an empty channel, but the silence of a species choosing, deliberately, not to respond. Team 2 reached the residential domes and found the same thing. Homes with meals half prepared, sitting cold on tables, lights left burning in empty rooms, personal belongings undisturbed, as though the entire population of Haven Ridge had simply stepped outside for a moment and would return any second. But no people, not one. I watched Korath's cruiser adjust its orbital scanners, sweeping the colony's thermal signature with growing intensity, searching for the 3,000 human life signs that should have been scattered across the surface. The scan returned results that made even my own sensors flicker with confusion. because the humans had not fled the colony. They were still there. My earlier readings had confirmed it. But something was interfering with the raiders' scanners, in a way that made individual life signs nearly impossible to isolate. I understood, a moment later, what Ethan Brooks and his 2 companions had been carrying through that service corridor. It was not a weapon. It was a scattering field, a piece of technology so far beneath Concord standards that my archive had classified similar devices as obsolete relics centuries ago, the kind of crude jamming equipment that primitive species sometimes built to disrupt basic scanning. I had assumed, when I first detected it, that it would do nothing against a modern raider ship's sensor suite. I had assumed wrong. Korath's ships were old, poorly maintained, built for intimidation rather than precision, and the crude human jamming field was proving to be exactly effective enough to turn his advantage into confusion. "Sensors are degraded," one of his officers reported. "We're reading heat signatures but can't isolate individuals. Something in the local environment is interfering." "Then use your eyes," Korath snapped back. "They're civilians, hiding in a mining colony, not ghosts." "Find them." Team 3, Korath's own squad, pushed deeper into the central plaza, past the looping false footage still playing on public displays, past the deceptively ordinary architecture of a settlement built for nothing more dramatic than digging ore out of frozen ground. I watched them move with the first genuine hesitation I had seen from any raider that night, weapons rising slightly, formation tightening. They had realized, faster than I expected, that something about this silence was wrong. It was too late for that realization to matter. I do not know, even now, how to describe what happened next without sounding as though I am exaggerating for effect. I have replayed the sensor recordings more times than I can count, and each time I watch them, I understand a little more clearly why my own report was initially dismissed by everyone who reviewed it. The first sign came from below, a section of the plaza's frozen ground, reinforced flooring built to support heavy mining equipment, shifted almost imperceptibly. Then a section of what I had catalogued as ordinary drainage infrastructure opened along a seam so cleanly disguised that not even my sensors had flagged it as anything other than natural terrain. Humans emerged from beneath Haven Ridge, not soldiers in the sense my archive understood soldiers, not wearing armor or carrying weapons that matched anything in the Concord's extensive catalog of galactic arms. They wore work suits, mining gear, thick insulated clothing meant for frozen labor shifts, and they moved with a coordination that had nothing to do with military training and everything to do with people who had built this colony with their own hands and knew every inch of it more intimately than any invader ever could. I recognized Ethan Brooks at the center of the group that rose up around Korath's team, his expression unreadable, his voice, when it finally came, carrying a calm that I found more unsettling than any display of fury could have been. "You destroyed our comm tower," he said, and I heard the words both through my sensors and through the open channel Korath's own team had left active, broadcasting their confusion directly to me without meaning to. "That tower took us 3 years to build. It connected us to every relief ship, every supply convoy, every family member who left to work on other worlds and wanted to hear a voice from home. You knocked it down in 60 seconds because you wanted us to be afraid." Korath's voice, when it answered, had lost every trace of its earlier confidence. "Stand down, you are outmatched. Surrender now and no one else needs to be hurt." "Else," Ethan repeated, and something in the way he said the word told me he had caught the raider captain's mistake before I had. That implies someone already has been. I checked the colony's outer perimeter, where the raider transports had landed, and found the answer waiting there. The 2 ground crew members left to guard each landing craft were no longer transmitting. Their positions on my sensor grid had gone dark, quietly, and without any signal of distress reaching the ships still in orbit. Whatever had happened to them had happened without alarm, without warning, and without giving Korath's fleet any indication that their exit route had already been compromised before the main confrontation had even begun. What followed in the central plaza was not the chaotic, desperate resistance my archive had led me to expect from a civilian population facing an armed raiding force. It was methodical. It was quiet. It was, in a way I struggled to categorize even as I watched it unfold in real time, almost gentle in its efficiency, as though the people of Haven Ridge had spent years preparing for exactly this moment, and had promised themselves, whatever else happened, that they would not let it become the kind of brutal spectacle the raiders had clearly expected to inflict on them. They used the terrain, they used the darkness, they used tools built for mining and construction, repurposed with an ingenuity that made my analytical processes struggle to keep pace with what I was recording. Nets woven from industrial cable. Sealant foam that hardened on contact, designed originally for patching hull breaches, now used to immobilize rather than injure. Sound dampeners that disoriented without harming. Every method I observed seemed built around a single, consistent principle that I did not fully understand until much later. They wanted the raiders to survive this. They wanted them to remember it. Korath's Team 3, 7 armed raiders who had walked into that plaza expecting an easy harvest, found themselves surrounded within minutes by colonists who knew every shadow, every angle, every possible avenue of retreat, because they had built this place stone by stone with their own hands. I watched 3 raiders go down beneath sealant foam that hardened around their weapons and boots before they even understood what had struck them. I watched 2 more, caught in a net trap so simple in its construction that it should not have worked against modern combat gear, and yet did, because it had been built by people who understood exactly what modern combat gear could and could not anticipate. Korath himself tried to retreat toward his landing craft and found the path blocked by Lucas Bennett, the older colonist I had seen leaving the service corridor earlier, standing with a stillness that reminded me, uncomfortably, of a predator far more patient than anything the Skarn had ever bred. "Your ship isn't taking off," Lucas said, and his voice carried none of the fear my archive insisted should be present in a civilian confronting an armed combatant. "Olivia's been in your landing systems for the last 20 minutes. You're not going anywhere until we decide you are." I pulled every scrap of data I could from the colony's hidden networks in that moment, trying to understand how a mining outpost with no military designation, no defense grid, no weapons signature detectable by any scan, had managed to prepare a response this complete, this coordinated, this utterly contrary to everything my species believed about human civilian populations under threat. The answer, when I finally found it buried in the colony's private records, was almost too simple to accept. Haven Ridge had been raided before. 6 years earlier, a different Skarn crew had struck a neighboring outpost, one the colonists here had known, had traded with, had lost friends and family to, when that raid succeeded exactly as raids like it always did. The survivors who eventually made their way to Haven Ridge had carried that memory with them, and rather than let it break them, they had spent every year since preparing so that it would never happen to them the same way twice. They had not built weapons the Concord would recognize as weapons, because weapons were forbidden under the trade agreements that let this colony access the shipping lanes it depended on for survival. Instead, they had built something else entirely, a response, a plan, a promise to each other, repeated so many times in colony meetings and late-night preparation drills that it had become instinct rather than strategy. I watched that promise fulfilled across the next 40 minutes, as raider after raider was neutralized, contained, or driven back toward transports that would never lift off the ground without the colony's permission. I watched Captain Korath's confident voice fracture into something closer to disbelief, then something closer to fear, as he realized the negligible species his archive had promised him would be an easy harvest was instead systematically, calmly, and almost surgically dismantling his entire raiding force without a single fatal blow struck on either side. I sat in my cloaked ship above it all, sensors recording every second, and felt the last of my professional detachment crumble away entirely. Because I understood, watching Ethan Brooks walk calmly through the wreckage of a raid that should have ended in tragedy, that I was not witnessing the destruction of Haven Ridge at all. I was witnessing the destruction of everything my archive had ever told me about what humans were capable of, and I had not yet seen the worst of it. I had not yet seen what happened when the last raider transport tried to flee, when Captain Korath's own crew turned on each other in the panic of realizing they were trapped, when the true cost of underestimating a species that had rebuilt itself in the shadow of loss finally became clear to everyone watching, human and observer alike. The night was far from over, and somewhere in the darkness below me, 3,000 humans who had been called negligible, fragile, and harmless were about to prove, once and for all, exactly how wrong that word had always been. I want to be precise about what I saw next, because precision is the only thing that kept me sane while I recorded it, and because every version of this story that spread afterward through Concord channels grew more exaggerated with each retelling. What actually happened in Haven Ridge that night did not need exaggeration. The truth was strange enough on its own. Captain Korath's remaining forces, reduced from 7 full squads to a scattered handful of raiders, still capable of moving under their own power, made their final attempt to reach the landing craft at the colony's edge. I watched the retreat unfold across my sensor grid with a strange, hollow feeling I did not yet have a name for, because it did not look like victory to me. It looked like something closer to a controlled demonstration, a lesson being taught with total, deliberate patience. 3 raiders reached the nearest transport first, moving faster than the others, weapons raised toward the darkness in case something else emerged from the shadows to stop them. The plaza behind them had gone quiet, the sounds of struggle fading into something almost peaceful, and for a moment I allowed myself to believe the confrontation had ended, that the colonists had done what they needed to do, and were now simply waiting. Then the transport's ramp failed to lower. I checked the ship's systems through my own sensors and found the answer immediately. Olivia Hart, the young colonist who had disappeared into the service corridor at the very start of the raid, had spent the last 30 minutes doing exactly what Lucas Bennett had promised Korath she was doing. She had not simply jammed the ship's scanners, she had found her way into its command systems entirely, using access ports that Skarn engineers had never bothered to secure properly, because no civilian population they had ever raided had possessed the knowledge or the patience to try. The 3 raiders at the transport pounded uselessly on a ramp that would not open, shouting into comm channels that no longer carried any signal beyond the colony's own jamming field, and I watched them realize, in the space of a few long seconds, that they were now the ones who had been surrounded. Ethan Brooks approached them from the plaza, unarmed, his hands visible and empty at his sides, and I understood in that moment why the colonists of Haven Ridge had chosen every method they used that night with such deliberate restraint. They were not trying to prove they could match the Skarn in violence. They were trying to prove something else entirely, something my archive had never once considered a possibility for a species it had labeled negligible. They were trying to prove they had a choice, and that they were choosing mercy on their own terms, rather than having survival forced upon them by someone else's rules. "You can put the weapons down," Ethan said, his voice carrying easily across the frozen air, picked up by my sensors with perfect clarity. "Or you can keep holding them, and see how that goes for you. Either way, you're not leaving until we say you are." I do not know what I expected the raiders to do. My archive contained no precedent for this exact situation, no case study of an armed combat force being offered a choice by the civilian population that had just defeated them. Fear made people unpredictable. I had seen enough recorded conflicts across enough worlds to know that desperation often produced the very violence that calm restraint was meant to avoid. One of the 3 raiders, younger than the others, his weapon shaking slightly in his grip, made the choice that ended the standoff. He lowered his weapon to the frozen ground and raised both hands, and after a long moment of hesitation, the other 2 followed his lead. I felt something shift inside me as I watched it happen, some deep recalibration of everything I thought I understood, and I realized with a discomfort I could not fully process, that I had spent the entire raid expecting the humans to eventually become what my archive insisted they were. Reactive, desperate, uncontrolled. I had been waiting, without fully admitting it to myself, for the moment when their calm discipline would break down into exactly the kind of chaotic violence my species associated with primitive cultures under threat. That moment never came. Not once, across the entire encounter, did I witness a single act of cruelty from the colonists of Haven Ridge, even as they dismantled a raiding force that had come to their home with every intention of destroying whatever resisted them and selling whatever did not. But I want to be honest about the other side of what I recorded that night, because it is the reason this account carries the title it does, and because I owe it to the truth, not to soften what I witnessed, simply because the humans conducted themselves with more restraint than I expected. Captain Korath, watching his entire operation collapse from the relative safety of his orbiting cruiser, made a decision in those final minutes that I believe, even now, he must have known was a mistake before he gave the order. Perhaps it was pride. Perhaps it was the simple, ugly panic of a predator, realizing too late that it had become prey. Whatever the reason, he ordered his cruiser's weapons to target the colony directly. A final act of destruction, meant to punish Haven Ridge for its defiance, even as his ground forces surrendered below. I detected the weapons charge sequence before the colony's own sensors did. and for the first time since I had begun my observation, I found myself faced with a choice my Concord training had never prepared me for. Non-interference protocol was absolute. I had been trained, drilled, and tested on the principle that an observer does not act, does not intervene, does not alter the natural course of events unfolding on a world under study, regardless of the outcome. The protocol existed for reasons I had always accepted without question. Contamination of primitive development, unintended consequences of premature contact, the long, careful philosophy of a species that had learned, over centuries, that intervention often caused more harm than the crisis it was meant to prevent. I sat with my hand hovering over a control I had never once expected to need, watching Korath's cruiser complete its weapons charge, watching 3,000 humans below me who had just shown more restraint and more courage than my own species' archive had ever credited them with, and I understood that if I did nothing, the ending of this story would not be the one I had spent the last several hours documenting with growing, reluctant admiration. It would be a massacre after all, simply not the one the title of my report had originally implied. I did not have time to resolve the philosophical weight of that choice. I did not need to. Because the humans of Haven Ridge, it turned out, had already solved the problem for me. I watched, through sensors that were beginning to feel less like scientific instruments and more like witnesses to something I did not have adequate language to describe, as a signal rose from the colony's outer perimeter, faint and crude by Concord standards, but precisely targeted at the one vulnerability Korath's cruiser possessed that his own crew had apparently never bothered to address. The colony's mining operations, I learned in that instant, relied on an old but powerful array of directional energy tools, originally designed to fracture frozen bedrock at a distance without endangering the workers using them. Repurposed, redirected, and fired in perfect coordination by a team I later learned included Mia Turner and Daniel Cole, two names I had seen only in passing residency records until that moment. The array struck Korath's cruiser, not with the intent to destroy it, but with enough precision to disable its weapons systems in the exact instant before they could fire. The cruiser's main battery discharged harmlessly into empty space, a brilliant flash of wasted energy that lit up the frozen sky above Haven Ridge like a false dawn, and then went dark entirely as its systems struggled to compensate for the sudden, unexpected damage. I sat in my cloaked ship, hand still hovering uselessly over a control I had never used, and felt something I can only describe as a strange, disorienting mixture of relief and shame. Relief, because the massacre I had feared had not happened. Shame, because in the moment it mattered most, I had hesitated, weighed protocol against consequence, and very nearly let 3,000 people become a statistic in an archive that had already failed them once by underestimating what they were capable of. The humans of Haven Ridge had not hesitated at all. Captain Korath's cruiser, weapons disabled, and crew in disarray, made no further attempt at retaliation. Within the hour, the remaining raiders, those still capable of surrender, had done so, disarmed and secured by colonists, who treated even their captives with a strange, careful dignity that I found more unsettling than any violence could have been, because it did not match anything in the framework I had been given to understand this species. I watched Ethan Brooks stand at the center of the plaza as the last of the fighting settled into silence, surrounded by colonists who bore the marks of a long, tense night, but no visible wounds, no scattered bodies, no scene of the carnage my archive would have predicted from a civilian population pushed to this kind of extremity. There had been losses. I confirmed later that 2 colonists had been injured during the initial raider assault before the trap had fully closed, and one, an older man named Noah Griggs who had been stationed at the outer perimeter, had not survived the raiders' opening strike on the comm tower's support crew. One loss, against 7 raider ships, an armed slaving force, and a captain who had ordered his own cruiser to fire on a civilian population rather than accept defeat. I ran the numbers again and again that night, unable to reconcile them with anything in my archive, unable to understand how a species my own people had dismissed as negligible had managed to turn an overwhelming military disadvantage into a decisive, almost bloodless victory through nothing more than preparation, patience, and a willingness to plan for the worst without ever losing sight of who they wanted to be when the worst finally arrived. Ethan Brooks knelt beside the place where Noah Griggs had fallen, and for a long moment, The calm, controlled leader I had watched direct an entire colony's defense with unshakable composure, allowed himself something else entirely. Grief, quiet and unguarded, the kind that did not care whether anyone was watching. I realized, watching that single moment of unfiltered human sorrow, that I had misjudged everything about what I came here to observe. My archive had told me humans were fragile because their emotions ran close to the surface, because they grieved openly, because they had not yet learned to bury their feelings beneath the practiced detachment my own species valued so highly. I understood now that this was not weakness. It had never been weakness. It was simply a different kind of strength, one that did not require the absence of feeling to remain steady under pressure, one that could grieve a friend in one breath and organize the careful, humane treatment of a defeated enemy in the next, without either impulse diminishing the other. I kept recording as Haven Ridge's colonists began the slow work of tending to their wounded, securing their prisoners, and rebuilding what the raid had cost them. And I understood, with a clarity that unsettled me more than the battle itself had, that the report I was about to file would either be dismissed as sensor malfunction or believed, and believed, would change everything my species thought it understood about the negligible little world it had never bothered to properly study. I did not know yet which outcome would prove worse. I only knew that I could not unsee what I had witnessed, and that somewhere in the frozen plaza below me, a species my archive had called fragile had just taught me the difference between being harmless and simply choosing not to be cruel. It was a distinction I would carry with me for the rest of my service, long after Haven Ridge became a name whispered carefully through every level of the Concord, long after Captain Korath's defeat became the first entry in a file that would eventually grow far too large to dismiss. But that story, the story of what happened when I brought my recordings home, is one that took its own kind of courage to tell. My return to Concord space should have been simple. Dock the ship, submit the report, wait for the routine acknowledgement that every observation mission received regardless of its content. That was how it had always worked. In every training simulation, in every account I had heard from senior observers who had spent decades cataloging primitive worlds without incident. Nothing about my return was simple. I submitted my full sensor recordings along with a written summary that I rewrote 4 times before finally accepting that no version of the truth would sound any less impossible than the one I had actually witnessed. 3,000 civilians, rated negligible under every existing threat classification, had defeated a 7-ship Skarn raiding force with a single fatality on their side and a captured enemy fleet left drifting in orbit above their colony. The first response I received came not from a superior but from an automated filter, the kind of system built to catch errors in observer reports before they reached anyone with the authority to act on them. My submission was flagged for sensor calibration review. A polite way, I would later learn, of saying that no one in the review queue believed what I had recorded was real. I requested an in-person hearing to present the footage directly, and after a delay of nearly 6 days, during which I sat in a holding bay wondering whether my entire career as an observer was about to end over a report no one would even watch, I was finally summoned before a review panel. The chamber was smaller than I expected. 3 senior officials seated behind a long curved desk, none of them familiar to me, all of them carrying the particular weariness of administrators who had reviewed a great many reports over a great many years and expected this one to be no different from the rest. The panel's lead reviewer, a stern official whose designation translated roughly to Director Halvorn, opened the session with a tone that made her skepticism clear before I had said a single word. Observer Vex, your report claims that a threat class negligible species successfully repelled an organized Skarn raiding operation with minimal casualties. You understand how that claim reads against every existing archive entry on human behavior. I understand, I said, and I felt the old instinct to soften the truth, to hedge my language the way junior observers were taught to do when presenting findings that contradicted established doctrine. I pushed past it. I also recorded it in full sensor fidelity, uninterrupted, from a cloaked position, with no possibility of the target population detecting or performing for my observation. What I submitted is not exaggeration. It is simply what happened. Director Halvorn exchanged a glance with the official beside her, a quieter man named Director Ossian, who had said nothing since the session began. Play the footage, she said finally, and I felt something in my chest loosen slightly. A fraction of relief that at least I would be given the chance to let the recordings speak for themselves. I do not think any amount of preparation could have made that hearing comfortable. I sat in silence as my own recordings played across the chamber's central display, watching the panel's expressions shift from clinical skepticism to something harder to read as the footage progressed. The comm tower's destruction, the colony's coordinated silence, the raiders walking confidently into a trap built from years of quiet preparation. Ethan Brooks's calm voice offering captured raiders a choice instead of cruelty. Captain Korath's desperate, failed attempt to destroy the colony rather than accept defeat. By the time the footage reached its end, the chamber had gone very quiet. This is either the most significant reclassification error in the history of the Concorde's observation program, Director Ossian said slowly, breaking the silence first, or it is the most sophisticated deception a supposedly primitive species has ever managed to construct for the benefit of an audience it should not have known existed. They did not know I was there, I said. My cloak was never compromised. There is no scenario in which the colonists of Haven Ridge staged this encounter for my benefit. Then explain it, Director Halvorn said, and for the first time, I heard something other than skepticism in her voice. Something closer to genuine unease. Explain how a species with no formal military doctrine, no standing defense force, and a threat classification that places them below dozens of other cataloged civilizations, managed to defeat an armed raiding fleet with almost no bloodshed on either side. I had spent the 6 days waiting for this hearing, turning that exact question over in my mind, replaying the footage until I had memorized every second of it, and I gave the panel the only answer I had found that felt honest. I don't believe our classification was wrong because we misjudged their strength, I said. I believe it was wrong because we misjudged what strength means to them. Our archive measures threat by weapons, by military structure, by the willingness to escalate violence quickly and decisively. The humans of Haven Ridge did not win because they were more violent than the raiders who attacked them. They won because they were more prepared, more patient, and more disciplined in choosing exactly how much force to use and when to stop using it. That is not a weakness we failed to notice. It is a strength we never thought to look for. The chamber fell silent again, longer this time, and I watched the three officials process a conclusion that clearly unsettled all of them in different ways. Director Ossian, I would later learn, had spent the better part of a century studying pre-contact civilizations, and the implications of my report struck at something fundamental in the assumptions his entire career had been built on. If this account is accurate, he said finally, and I am not yet prepared to say it is, then the question we must answer is not whether Haven Ridge was an isolated incident. The question is how many other observer reports over the years have described human populations as fragile, disorganized, or emotionally unstable, when the reality was closer to what we have just witnessed. Restraint, mistaken for weakness. Preparation, mistaken for chaos. Grief, mistaken for instability. I had not expected vindication that day, and I did not entirely receive it. The panel adjourned, without issuing a formal ruling, informing me only that my report would be cross-referenced against other recent observer logs from human-colonized systems, before any decision on reclassification would be made. I returned to my quarters that night, uncertain whether I had just accomplished something meaningful or simply delayed the moment my career would be quietly ended, for filing a report no one wanted to believe. The answer arrived 17 days later, and it did not arrive the way I expected. It began with a single additional report, filed by an observer stationed at a different human colony, nearly 40 light-years from Haven Ridge, describing a strikingly similar pattern. A resource dispute escalating into an attempted hostile takeover by an unaffiliated mercenary company, met not with panic, but with the same eerie, coordinated calm I had witnessed myself, the same careful restraint paired with total, uncompromising resolve. Then a second report arrived, from a colony closer to Concorde Central Space, describing a natural disaster response that defied every assumption my archive held about how a fragile, emotionally reactive species should behave under catastrophic stress. Instead of collapsing into disorder, the human population had organized rescue efforts within hours, prioritizing the vulnerable, rebuilding with a speed and coordination that the filing observer described, almost word for word, in the same disbelieving language I had used in my own report. A third came, then a fourth. Within a month of my hearing, no fewer than 11 separate observer logs had surfaced, describing human populations across scattered colonies, responding to crisis, threat, and loss, with a consistency that made the old classification of negligible feel less like a scientific assessment and more like a convenient assumption no one had ever bothered to properly test. I was summoned back before the review panel a second time, and this time the chamber was not nearly as small. Additional officials had joined Director Halvorn and Director Ossian, representatives from other divisions of the Concorde's observation program, all of them present to hear what was quickly becoming known, in the quiet, careful language of official proceedings, as the Haven Ridge precedent. "Observer Vex," Director Halvorn said, and I noticed, this time, that her earlier skepticism had softened into something closer to grave consideration. "Your report has become the founding case study in what may be the largest reclassification effort in the history of this division. I want to be clear about what that means. If the panel accepts the conclusions your footage supports, every existing assessment of human civilization within Concorde archives will need to be reviewed, and very likely revised. I understand the scope of what I'm asking," I said. "I don't think you do," Director Ossian said, not unkindly. "Because if we are wrong about this species in the specific ways your report suggests, we may be wrong about them in ways we have not yet begun to imagine. A species capable of the discipline you witnessed at Haven Ridge, capable of that degree of preparation, patience, and restraint under existential threat, is not negligible. It may not even be primitive, in the sense our classifications have always assumed. It may simply be young, and young, in a species with those particular strengths, is a very different kind of variable to plan for than negligible ever was." I sat with that assessment for a long moment before answering, because it echoed something I had felt since the earliest hours of the Haven Ridge raid, something I had not yet found the right words to express, even in my own report. "I did not go to that colony expecting to witness a massacre," I said finally. "I went expecting to document a footnote, a species too fragile to matter, living out the quiet, unremarkable final chapters of a civilization the archive had already decided would never amount to much. What I witnessed instead was not fragility, it was not chaos, it was a species that has learned, through loss, exactly what it is willing to become, in order to protect what it loves, and exactly what it refuses to become, even when given every justification to cross that line." I paused, choosing my next words carefully, because I understood, even as I spoke them, that they would follow me for the rest of my career. We called them negligible, because we never gave them the chance to show us otherwise. I believe that mistake has already cost lives on other worlds we never properly investigated. I believe it will cost more if we do not correct it now. The panel did not issue a decision that day either, but when I left the chamber, Director Ossian stopped me in the corridor outside, his expression carrying a weight I had not seen from him during the formal proceedings. "Whatever the panel decides," he said quietly, "I want you to understand something. Reports like yours do not simply correct an archive entry. They change how an entire civilization sees itself in relation to species it has spent centuries looking down on, without ever truly looking at all. That is a heavier responsibility than most observers ever carry. I hope you are prepared for it." I was not certain, in that moment, that I was prepared for anything the coming weeks would bring. But I knew, with a certainty that had not existed in me before Haven Ridge, that I could not go back to filing reports the way I once had, treating primitive classifications as settled fact, rather than an assumption still waiting to be tested. 3 weeks later, the Concorde's Observation Division issued a directive I had never expected to see in my lifetime. Human civilization, across every known colonized system, was to be formally reclassified, pending further study, from threat class negligible, to a new and unprecedented designation, reserved for species whose true capabilities remained insufficiently understood to categorize with confidence. They called it Threat Class Undetermined. I would come to understand, in the months that followed, that this quiet, cautious phrase was the closest thing to an apology the Concorde's rigid bureaucracy had ever offered an entire species it had misjudged. And I was given a new assignment, one I had not requested but would not have refused, even if I had the choice. I was to return to Haven Ridge, not as a distant, cloaked observer recording from orbit, but as something the Concorde had never before authorized for a species so recently reclassified. A liaison, sent not to watch humanity from a careful, clinical distance, but to finally, properly, try to understand it. I returned to Haven Ridge 9 weeks after the raid, and this time, My ship did not carry a cloaking field. This time, when I entered the system, I transmitted an open, formal request for permission to land, and I waited, with a patience I had not known I possessed before that year, for a species I had once dismissed as negligible to decide whether they trusted me enough to say yes. The response came from Ethan Brooks himself, and I recognized his voice immediately from the recordings I had reviewed so many times that his cadence had become as familiar to me as my own. There was no hostility in it, but there was no easy warmth either. Only a careful, measured caution that I understood completely, because I had watched, in painstaking detail, exactly what this colony had survived to earn the right to be cautious. "Permission granted," he said. "But you'll understand, if we watch you as closely as you once watched us." I told him I would expect nothing less. The colony I found on the surface looked almost nothing like the darkened, silent settlement I had recorded from orbit during the raid. The comm tower had been rebuilt, taller and sturdier than before. A deliberate choice, I would later learn, meant less as practical necessity and more as a quiet statement of defiance against anyone who might think destroying it once had settled anything. The central plaza, where I had watched Captain Korath's forces walk unknowingly into a trap built from years of careful preparation, now held something else entirely. A modest memorial, simple stone and metal, bearing a single name: Noah Griggs. I stood before it for a long moment on my first day back, and Ethan Brooks found me there, watching me with an expression I could not fully read. "You recorded the whole thing," he said. It was not quite a question. "I did," I said. "I recorded his death, and I recorded everything your colony did afterward to make sure it would not happen to anyone else. I am sorry for what it cost you to prove what you proved that night." Something shifted in Ethan's expression, a fraction of the guardedness easing, though not disappearing entirely. "Most of the colonies out here have a story like ours," he said. "Different names, different worlds, same lesson. You lose people you love, and you decide, somewhere in that grief, that you're never going to be caught helpless again. It isn't really about the raiders, in the end. It's about making sure the people you have left get to keep living their lives, without being afraid, every single day." I spent the following months doing what my new role required of me, and what I discovered, colony by colony, conversation by conversation, was a species far more complicated than either the negligible classification my archive had once assigned it, or the fearsome reputation Haven Ridge had briefly, unfairly, begun to earn among Concord officials who had only ever seen the sensor footage without the context surrounding it. I met Olivia Hart, the young woman who had disabled an entire raider transport from a service corridor, using knowledge she had taught herself through nothing more than patience and old salvaged manuals, and learned that she had wanted, before the raid ever happened, to become an engineer who designed better life support systems for colonies, just like her own. She was studying toward that goal again now, in whatever spare hours remained after helping rebuild the very systems she had once used to defend her home. I met Lucas Bennett, who had stood so calmly between Captain Korath and his escape route, and learned that he had spent decades before the raid working not in defense or security, but in agricultural engineering, coaxing crops out of frozen hostile soil, so that a colony built on mining could still feed itself without depending entirely on supply convoys that did not always arrive on schedule. I met Mia Turner and Daniel Cole, who had disabled Korath's cruiser with a repurposed mining tool never designed for anything resembling combat, and found two people who spoke about that night, not with pride, but with a quiet, lingering discomfort, as though the necessity of what they had done still weighed on them even months later, even knowing how much worse the alternative would have been. None of them, I came to understand, saw themselves as warriors. They saw themselves as people who had simply refused to let the worst version of that night become the only version available to them. I asked Ethan Brooks, during one of our long conversations in the rebuilt operations room, the question that had followed me since the first hours of the raid, the one I had never fully resolved even after everything I had witnessed and everything I had since learned. "How did you know," I asked, "that restraint would work, that you could defeat an armed raiding force without becoming as ruthless as the people attacking you? You had every justification to meet violence with violence. Most species in our archive choose that path when survival is at stake. Why didn't you?" Ethan considered the question for a long moment before answering, and when he did, His voice carried the particular weight of someone who had thought about this exact issue many times before, likely long before I had ever arrived to ask him about it. Because the moment we stop choosing who we want to be, he said, is the moment the people who hurt us actually win, even if we survive the fight. We didn't build this colony to become the kind of people who need to hurt others to feel safe. We built it so our kids could grow up somewhere that didn't require that. If we'd let that night turn us into something cruel, just because we had the power to be, we would have lost something a lot more important than the fight itself. I thought about that answer for a long time afterward, turning it over against everything my archive had once taught me about primitive species and the violence they were assumed to default to under sufficient pressure. I understood, more clearly with each passing week, that my species' old classification of humanity had not simply underestimated their capability. It had fundamentally misunderstood their values, mistaking restraint for weakness, because it had never occurred to anyone compiling that archive that a species could hold both overwhelming capability and deliberate, chosen mercy at the same time, without one canceling out the other. Months passed. I watched Haven Ridge continue rebuilding, not just its physical structures but the quieter, harder work of processing what the colony had survived. I watched colonists who had lost friends grieve in ways that were loud and unguarded one day, quiet and private the next, never following the neat, predictable patterns my old archive had once assumed defined every human emotional response. I watched children who had been kept safely hidden during the raid grow comfortable enough, weeks later, to ask their parents blunt, curious questions about what had happened, and I watched those parents answer honestly, without shielding them from the truth, but also without letting that truth become the only story that defined their home. I thought often about Captain Korath during those months as well. He and his surviving crew had been transferred, eventually, to a proper Concord detention facility, rather than left in the colony's custody indefinitely, and I learned, through official channels, that his testimony had corroborated every detail of my original report, delivered with the particular bitterness of a man who still could not fully explain, even to himself, how a raid he had expected to be effortless had ended with his entire fleet disabled by people his own archive had assured him would never be capable of such a thing. I did not feel triumph learning that. I felt something closer to the same discomfort Mia Turner and Daniel Cole had described to me, a recognition that even a victory achieved through restraint still carried a cost, still left marks on everyone involved that did not simply disappear because the outcome had ultimately been just. Nearly a year after the raid, I stood once more in the central plaza of Haven Ridge, this time at the edge of a celebration, rather than the wreckage of a battle. The colony had gathered to mark the anniversary of the comm tower's original construction, a tradition I learned that predated the raid entirely, though it had taken on new meaning since. Music played from speakers rigged up by colonists who had spent the afternoon arguing cheerfully about which songs belonged on the playlist. Children ran between adults who watched them with the particular, unguarded warmth I had come to recognize as uniquely, unmistakably human. Ethan Brooks stood near the memorial to Noah Griggs, sharing a quiet laugh with Olivia Hart and Lucas Bennett over some story I had not been present to overhear, the kind of easy, ordinary happiness that existed alongside grief, rather than pretending grief had never happened at all. I stood at the edge of it all, an observer who had come to this world expecting to catalog a footnote species, and instead found something my entire civilization had never properly understood, and I found myself thinking back to the first hours of the raid, to the cold, analytical distance I had maintained, while watching Ethan Brooks give the order that would define everything that followed. Initiate Quiet House Protocol. I understood now, in a way I had not understood then, that those 4 words had never been about violence at all. They had been about a promise a community had made to itself, long before I ever arrived to watch them keep it. A promise that they would protect what they loved without losing themselves in the process. That they would meet the worst of what the galaxy could throw at them, without becoming the worst of what they were capable of being in return. I had come to Haven Ridge to observe humans. I had left convinced I had witnessed a massacre, and in the strictest, most literal sense, I suppose I had, though not the one my title had originally implied, and not one carried out by the species my archive had once dismissed as fragile. What I witnessed instead, standing now among people who had every reason to distrust an observer from a species that had spent so long looking down on them without ever truly looking at all, was something far more difficult to categorize, something no single word in my archive fully captured. I had witnessed a people who understood, more completely than my own species ever had, that strength was not measured by how much violence you were willing to inflict, but by how much restraint you could maintain, even when violence would have been so much easier to justify. Ethan Brooks caught my eye across the plaza and offered a small, genuine nod, the kind of quiet acknowledgement that required no translation, no analysis, no careful parsing through unfamiliar cultural context. I returned it, and for the first time since I had arrived in this system so many months ago, I felt something my training had never prepared me to name, but which I had come, slowly and completely, to recognize as simple, uncomplicated respect. I came to Haven Ridge to observe humans. I stayed because I finally understood there was so much more to them than any observation could ever fully capture, and because some truths, I had learned, are worth staying close enough to witness for the rest of your life.